One time he locked me in containers with his shipment of kids. There were kids in there that didn't speak English. There were kids that were sick and that were already dying. There were babies. There were babies that were 6 years old, and I'll never forget them just crying, and everybody was just staring at them. Everybody was just staring at each other. Nobody knew whether or not to move. I was freaked out. And I got up and I held her.
When I received the first call to work for D, I thought it was a dream come true, an opportunity to take care of his children, to live in a world of glamour and luxury. I was a simple woman, a caregiver with a knack for looking after little ones, and this seemed like a chance to change my life for the better. From the moment I stepped into his sprawling mansion, something felt off. The opulence was almost suffocating. High ceilings loomed above, adorned with crystal chandeliers casting strange, flickering shadows. The house seemed alive, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear yet. But I brushed those feelings aside. I had a job to do. D was charming, no doubt. His smile was magnetic, his children delightful. I spent my days with them in the vast gardens, their laughter echoing among the marble statues. But at sunset, the atmosphere shifted. The house grew quieter, darker. The walls seemed to close in. One evening, I was asked to stay late. D was hosting a gathering of his friends, a VIP group whose names were whispered in awe by the staff. I was to keep the children upstairs, away from the guests. Simple enough, or so I thought. Curiosity crept over me like a slow poison. The night was silent, broken only by the murmur of voices below. It was a low, pulsing sound, almost hypnotic, resonating through my bones. Heart pounding, I tiptoed toward the grand staircase. Each step echoed loudly, amplified by the oppressive silence of the house. I leaned on the railing, holding my breath. Candlelight flickered in the grand living room, casting dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Dee's friends were there, their laughter dark and muffled like a poisonous whisper. Their slick bodies gleamed in the dim light, moving with an almost unnatural slowness, as if part of a secret rite. The smell was the first clue. Sweet, nauseating, a scent that clung to the back of my throat. Then I saw them. Objects, strange and twisted. I couldn't identify them, but their purpose seemed too obvious, too horrifying to accept. And then the children. They were there, small and fragile, trapped in a circle of those powerful men and women. My heart stopped. The children's eyes were wide, lost in a void of confusion and terror. They didn't understand, but I did. Their innocence was being stripped away, disguised as a cruel, perverse game. A deep laugh made me jump. One of the men leaned down to a child, whispering something too low for me to hear. The child visibly trembled but didn't dare move. I wanted to scream, to rush down and pull them away, but fear gripped me like a cold vice. I stood there frozen, praying it was a hallucination. But the reality was too raw, too vivid. I withdrew into the shadows, heart pounding. I had to understand. I had to know what was really happening in that house. The next day, every glance from D felt like it burned my skin. His charm, once irresistible, now felt like a thin mask covering something infinitely darker. Each smile concealed an abyss, and I was dangerously close to falling in. "You seem tired," he said with a kindness that felt hollow. "Maybe you should take a break." I nodded, unable to respond. I knew I had to leave, tell someone, but a dark force held me back. A morbid curiosity, a visceral need to see beneath the surface. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the house's silence was broken by furtive movements. The same voices, now hushed and secretive, slithered down the corridors like snakes. I rose, legs trembling, and followed the sounds. I stayed in the shadows, my breath fractured by growing terror. D led his guests down a narrow staircase, a hidden door behind a heavy velvet curtain. The descent felt endless, each step leading deeper into an abyss of darkness and cold. The basement was a nightmare. The air was thick. The stench of iron and decay enveloped me, squeezing like an oppressive vice. The ceiling was low, the walls bare and crude, covered in strange carvings that seemed to pulse in the dim torchlight. In the center of the room stood a black stone altar. Dark stains covered it, remnants of ancient, terrible rituals. Dee stopped before it, raising his arms. His voice, once warm and welcoming, now turned into a guttural roar of ancient, unknown words. The guests moved in a circle, their eyes lost in a trance. One of them brought forward a child, the little one's face twisted in terror. They tied him to the altar, his screams muffled by a heavy hand. My body froze, terror choking me. This wasn't imagination, it was real. And I was trapped in the heart of evil itself. What I saw in that basement will haunt me for the rest of my days. Every time I close my eyes, I relive that scene. The room was vast, its stone walls seeming to pulse with a malignant heartbeat. Heavy chains hung from the walls, clinking faintly with a sinister air. People, both children and adults, were chained, their gaunt faces hollowed out like masks of eternal pain. They didn't scream. They barely moved. Their eyes, empty and lifeless, stared into nothingness, as if their spirits had long fled, leaving behind empty shells. The center of the room was dominated by an altar, a stone block stained with dark blood, both fresh and ancient. Dee and his friends gathered around it, forming a circle that seemed to bind every soul present. Their faces were illuminated by the flickering candlelight, casting deformed, dancing shadows on the walls. They chanted in a language I had never heard, the harsh, guttural words weaving into an arcane spell that made my skin crawl. They held knives, their edges gleaming cruelly in the candlelight. The blades reflected the fire as if forged in hell itself. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but I couldn't move. Terror enveloped me, my legs petrified. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a ritual, a sacrifice, and I was a witness, trapped in a living nightmare. I knew I couldn't save them all, but I had to try. Every second spent there was a risk, a step closer to the end. Heart pounding in my ears, I climbed the stairs in silence, my thoughts swirling like a storm. I had to get the children, get out of that cursed house before it was too late. But when I reached their rooms, panic gripped me. The rooms were empty, the beds untouched. Dee's children were gone. A wave of despair washed over me. Were they downstairs? Were they part of that ceremony? Every passing second felt like an eternity, and the realization that they might be down there, among those chains, paralyzed me. I had to act fast, but just as I turned to flee, a shiver ran down my spine. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, the fingers tightening like claws. I turned slowly, terror clawing at me. Dee was there, his face a portrait of malevolence. His smile, once charming, was now predatory, a gash of pure malice. His eyes gleamed with a dark light, the promise of something terrible. "You've seen too much," he whispered, his voice a buzz that seemed to vibrate with a dark power. "You'll have to stay." I tried to pull away from his grasp, but it was as if the house's very shadow had seized me, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. With a smile that revealed cruel calm, Dee dragged me down the stairs. Each step was a descent into the abyss, the sound of our footsteps an echo that seemed to summon demons from the depths. The darkness seemed to envelop us, alive and pulsing, breathing with its own rhythm. "The children haven't run away," he said, his voice a hiss that seemed to blend with the darkness. "They're part of something bigger, something you can't even begin to understand." I tried to resist, but my body was rigid with terror. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but fear held me in invisible chains, stronger than those hanging from the basement walls. Days passed, maybe weeks, although they felt like centuries. The others around me, those chained to the walls, never spoke. Their eyes, empty and devoid of light, stared at nothing, as if their souls had been devoured by the darkness. But when the house slept, when even the shadows seemed to hold their breath, I began to hear the whispers. They were faint, as if coming from another world, slipping through the cracks in the stone walls. The voices spoke of escape, revenge, and an ancient power imprisoning the place. They were fragments of broken conversations, a collective murmur that seemed neither fully human nor entirely supernatural. I strained to hear every word, every stifled whisper, hoping to grasp a clue, a secret that could open the way out. "The chain that binds you," a guttural voice whispered, "is not made of metal, but of fear." I felt my heart pound harder. The basement wasn't just a place of physical captivity. It was a mental prison built with terror. I had to find the strength to break both. One night, a boy no older than 10 chained across from me, lifted his gaze. His eyes, once lifeless and dull, now glowed with a light I hadn't seen in too long. Hope. He approached slowly, dragging chains that screeched against the stone. His lips barely moved. "Tonight," he whispered. For a moment, my blood ran cold. The thought of attempting escape filled me with terror. But in his eyes, I saw unwavering determination. I nodded, barely perceptible, and in that moment our pact was sealed. Around us, an invisible wave of energy seemed to ripple through the room. Even the chains felt heavier, as if aware of our intent and trying to resist. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more urgent. "You are not alone," the voices said. "Jabba. Tonight, the blood will not only be yours." Every nerve in my body was tense as we waited. Minutes dragged on. Every creak and footstep above us seemed amplified in the darkness. The boy gave me one last look before the basement door opened, revealing the sinister procession descending with heavy steps. That night, the darkness in the cellar felt thicker, as if the shadows themselves were alive, breathing in sync with the guttural chants that echoed between the stone walls. D and his followers descended once more, their footsteps echoing in a slow, deliberate march. Their eyes were fixed, devoid of emotion, caught in an almost animalistic fervor. I watched them from behind the chains, my heart racing. I knew every second was vital. I waited for the crucial moment when their attention would be fully on the sacrifice, their eyes glazed over, almost in a trance, as the ceremonial blade gleamed in the flickering candlelight. With trembling hands, I gripped the rusty chains around my wrists. Beside me, the boy struggled with his chains, his breathing as labored as mine. I could feel his terror, but also his determination. I whispered under my breath, "Keep going. We have to make it." With a chilling snap, the chains gave way, the metallic sound echoing through the room. I held my breath, but the followers, lost in their ritual, noticed nothing. It was as if the cellar itself wanted to rid itself of its cursed burden. Without hesitation, I grabbed a candle from the floor. My hands burned from the hot wax, but I didn't care. With a stifled cry, I hurled the candle towards the altar, the flames quickly engulfing the velvet drapes adorning the room. The fire climbed with a voracious fury, consuming the fabric, spreading a hellish glow. D screamed, his face twisted in pure rage. "Stop them!" he shouted, but it was already too late. Chaos erupted in the room. Followers screamed as thick black smoke spread, drowning out every other sound. Smoke filled my lungs, burning with every breath. The boy coughed, his eyes full of tears as we desperately searched for a way out. The flames roared behind us, the heat chasing us like a monster in the shadows. "This way," I whispered, grabbing his small, cold hand in mine. We headed towards the hidden staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath our hurried feet. Behind us, Dee's furious shouts echoed, a constant reminder of the danger pursuing us. "The door!" the boy gasped, pointing to an exit at the end of the corridor. With hearts pounding, we dashed into the main hall. The fresh air hit us like a relief, but the house wasn't ready to let us go so easily. The corridors seemed to stretch and distort, as if the mansion wanted to confuse us, keeping its secrets tight. "Where do you think you're going?" Dee's voice boomed, deep and cruel, resonating in every corner of the hall. I turned, my heart frozen in fear, only to see his figure advancing through the smoke, his twisted smile illuminated by the flames behind him. "You can't escape," he hissed, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "You belong to me." The house trembled as if responding to his command. The barred door slammed shut with a dull thud. The windows clattered, denying us every way out. The shadows seemed to stretch, enveloping us, drawing closer. "No," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "We don't belong to you." With fierce determination, I took the boy's hand and ran toward the opposite side of the hall. Every step was an act of defiance, every breath a refusal of the fear that sought to suffocate me. Upstairs, I pointed to a staircase that seemed to lead to the upper floors. Maybe, just maybe, we would find refuge there. But as we ran, I could feel the darkness closing in, and Dee's laughter echoed like a threat. Just when despair was about to overwhelm me, we burst into the library, a dark room filled with old books. There, standing in the dim light, was an elderly woman I had never seen before. Her eyes, deep and knowing, met mine. "You have seen the truth," she said softly, "and now you must destroy it." She handed me a small, decorated dagger, its blade etched with symbols I couldn't understand. "This will kill him, but be quick, for his power grows with every soul he consumes." I nodded, understanding that this was our only chance. The boy and I turned to leave, but she raised a hand. "Take this." She pressed a small, worn medallion into my palm. "It will guide you." We found Dee in the grand hall, the flames from the basement licking the walls, their crackling drowning out everything else. The once opulent surroundings now seemed the desolate ruins of a place consumed by greed and darkness. Dee's face was no longer that of the charming, confident man I had once met. It was twisted, filled with rage and terror. He was alone now, his followers nowhere in sight. I could hear their distant, frantic screams, but they were muffled by the roaring inferno below. His eyes, once so magnetic, now glowed with a malevolent fire. He stepped forward, his steps slow, deliberate, each movement precise, calculated. "You think you can escape?" he sneered, his voice a twisted melody of menace. "This house is mine, this place is mine, and now you are mine." I felt his power crushing down on me, as if the mansion itself was closing in, every creak of the floor a warning. I wanted to run, to return to the flames, but I knew there was no place left to hide. The only way out was to face him. I raised the dagger. The blade felt strangely warm, as if it were alive. My breath quickened. The medallion around my neck grew warm against my skin, buzzing as if it were part of my heart beating faster. Dee saw the movement and smiled, a wicked, predatory smile. "You're too weak to stop me. Here, I control everything. Your pathetic boy, are just pawns in my game." As he advanced, I saw the flicker of shadows behind him. They danced and twisted in unnatural ways, swirling around him like servants of a dark king. With a guttural laugh, he lunged. "Die!" The blade sank into his chest with a dull sound, but no blood flowed. Instead, a black, viscous substance began to ooze from the wound, like spilled ink. His body convulsed, and in his eyes, there was no fear of death, but something far darker. For a fraction of a second, time stopped. His mouth opened in a scream that echoed down the corridor. It wasn't human. It was a monstrous, gurgling wail that shook the foundations of the house. Then the walls shook. The entire mansion seemed to tremble. The walls cracked as if the house were being torn apart by an invisible force. Dee's body convulsed, slowly disintegrating. His flesh peeled away in chunks, revealing only darkness underneath. His final words, whispered in a voice that wasn't his own, sent shivers down my spine. "You can't stop it, I am everywhere." And then he was gone, vanishing into the void that had opened beneath him, leaving only the smell of burnt flesh and the sound of crumbling stone. The villa collapsed around us as we fled into the night, flames reducing the once grand structure to ashes. We stood in the cold, gasping for breath, watching the inferno consume the last remnants of Dee's world. In the distance, sirens wailed, drawing closer, but I felt no fear. The nightmare was over. The boy clung to my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I opened the locket. Inside was a photograph of a young girl. My mother, I realized. The same eyes, the same strength. She had faced this darkness before and survived. And now, I had survived too. The authorities arrived, pulling survivors from the rubble. But there was no trace of Dee or his followers, no evidence of the horrors that had taken place beneath the villa. The world would never know the full extent of the darkness we had faced. But I knew, and so did the boy. We were free, but forever changed. The scars of that night would remain, a reminder of the evil lurking beneath the surface of power and privilege. Yet, in the face of that darkness, we had found strength, and in each other we had found hope. As we walked away from the smoldering ruins, I felt a weight lift from my soul. The shadows no longer haunted my steps. The whispers had ceased, and in their place was silence, a peaceful, liberating silence. The nightmare was over, and the dawn was ours.